the real Michael Kaskey-Blomain, at the real Mike KB on Twitter. CBS Sports covers the Sixers in the NBA, and he joins us now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. A wretched performance last night, Michael. Where does it leave you feeling about this team after watching that team today?
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty rough, Mike, and I think it'd be pretty hard to feel, too positive, obviously, after not only that performance, but, 3 straight losses on the road and an overall 9-18 road record for a team with championship aspirations. That's not great.
It's not. You tweeted out a picture of a gentleman on a phone with like 19 phones up to his ear, and you wrote Elton Brand over the next 2 days. Are these performances – now this was a Saturday in Boston and last night in Miami. Are these 2 performances eye-opening enough that they feel like they need to again drastically change this roster?
I think it's a kind of a play-it-by-ear situation, Mike. I think that, obviously that's not the goal. I think that they really would like to at least have one playoff series or, one postseason run with this team as currently constructed, at least in terms of the core guys that they brought in over this summer. Brett has said, obviously, that it's a team that's built for the playoffs, and I think they would like to at least see that. But at the same time, I think it's impossible for them not to watch what's happening in these recent games and, over the course of the entire season in terms of the inconsistency and the poor play on the road and the, average play against teams that are 500 or better. I think you really have to kind of evaluate all options, not necessarily in terms of trading Joel or Ben. I think that's still off the table. But, a week or two ago, I thought that pretty much the moves that they would make leading up to the deadline would be limited to, bench players and picks. And while that's probably still the case, I have to think that if an offer for, Al Horford came across Elton's desk, he would have to, really think long and hard about making a move like that.
MKB, what's up, man? So I have 2 questions here in one. And one is the most fixable issue in your mind right now. Like, if Brett Brown just did this would change things for the better. And then the second part of that is another issue, but it's more bigger picture, like the philosophy of ownership in Elton Brand, or the moves and the continuously evolving roster because of Elton Brand, something like that.
I think the first part that they could do in the short term, it's just a lineup tweak. I think it has to be. I'm sure it's probably been mentioned, on the show. I was talking with you guys already today. I think you got to move Al to the bench in the short term. It's obviously the way the starting lineup is coexisted together. It's not working. The spacing isn't working. I think we saw when Joel was out and Al was playing center, how that kind of opened up the floor more for, Ben to be able to attack, get downhill more, and put some of the shooters, whether it be Korkmaz, Matisse, any of these guys around Ben. You do the same thing basically with Joel at the center spot. That'll allow, it'll open up a little bit more space that Al's been taking up, and it will allow Al to operate more time, more of his time on the floor as a center, which is where he's, clearly more comfortable. It's a more natural fit for him. And I think, that would just maximize what the Sixers can do while obviously still trying to make the best of, having Ben and Joel stagger their minutes, but it would just open things up for them a little bit more. In the short term, I think that's one solution. If they'd actually do it, considering the amount of money they just, invested in Al over the summer, that's another question. But, and the thing with Elton Brand, it's a good question. And honestly, this goes back to, a few years ago. The worst part about the situation for me is how tough the options are right now. You have Al and Tobias, locked up for the foreseeable future on big money deals. The value for them around the league is pretty, you're not going to get, even if you were to move them, you're not going to get value back in terms of that contract. A lot of the assets that were acquired over the quote unquote process years have been used now. So you're the ownership and Elton have kind of backed the team into a corner in terms of where they are at this point, where you feel like, you almost have to go all in now. If you want to make a substantial move at this deadline, Zaire Smith doesn't have a lot of value across the league. Mike Scott doesn't have a lot of value across the league. If you're going to move the needle at all for a deal, if you're the Sixers, you're going to have to include, your second round picks, your future first round picks, basically, mortgage your future to try to maximize your present, which is what they've done by the moves they did last summer. So, it's just pretty much, it's been a 180 from obviously the years of having the longest view in the road and building yourself up to be, sustainable success for a long time. It's now basically, the Sixers have this window now that they have to, go all in for. And if it doesn't work out now, the future is not necessarily going to be very bright.
All right. So trade deadline quickly approaching here. And Shander was on obviously earlier from 12 to 2, and he made some good points that I agreed with. One being, you can't just overhaul the roster again here. Let them have a team for once from start to finish. Let them work it out. And I completely agree with that mindset. But I'm going to ask you this question, and if the answer is no, then I would think that they should be aggressive at the deadline. Do you feel right now, MKB, if you had to answer strictly yes or no, do you feel that this Sixers team can make a deep playoff run?
Yeah, I do. I still do think they can make a deep playoff run. I'm not as confident in saying that as I was, maybe 2 weeks ago. But I do think in a series in playoff basketball, depending on matchups, that they could. I do think they could still make a deep playoff run.
Michael Kaskey-Blomain, CBS Sports, covers the Sixers. Let me ask you the question then about, okay, there was an article in the New York papers about 2-3 weeks ago regarding the ownership group meddling with the Devils. Did you see that? Did we lose you, Michael?
Oh, no, like I'm here. I did see that.
Okay.
I saw that.
So that has not really been brought up with the Sixers, has it? And do you feel like if it's happening with the Devils, then it must be happening with the Sixers? Or do you think that just magically operate their organizations differently?
Mike, it's tough to say because, at least from my experience, they have done a pretty good job of separating the two organizations. I haven't seen much spill over in terms of the way the Devils are operated and the Sixers are operated. So I'm purely speculating. I haven't heard anything, but you would also have to think that if, it's something they're considering and doing with the Devils, why wouldn't it be something that they would also be considering to do with the Sixers?
Right. So I asked that question in this regard of, do you think that the ownership group has forced this team to kind of accelerate itself and that the constant changing of the rosters for young players like Ben Simmons, Joel Embiid, and then putting the coach into this situation has affected the team to the point where you're starting to see them almost shut down because they're so frustrated?
Yeah, Mike, I think that's definitely possible. I think it's, the constant upheaval and constant uncertainty is exactly what's going on. Like, we've talked about several times over this year. They have, they've had basically 3 different rosters since the very beginning of last season. And it's extremely difficult, even though the 2 core pieces have been the same in Embiid and Simmons, obviously, it's been really difficult for them to get any sort of rhythm with, the constant changes. And I think you see, some of these other teams obviously have been able to get quick success, like, you look at the Lakers or the Clippers, but, you're talking about guys that are veterans and have been around for a while. I think for a team that's built like the Sixers, where you have young guys, I think it's important to kind of build it organically and, have these guys gain chemistry with each other, sort of like they've done in Milwaukee around Giannis, where they've had, basically the same roster. They've built around him for a few years and kind of just let it mature organically. The Sixers haven't had to do that, for better or worse, and I do think that there's been, a time, like a push from ownership ever since, honestly, Colangelo was allowed into the organization in the first place. I think that was kind of to expedite the process, and I think ever since then, they've obviously tried to backpedal and separate themselves from that move, and go with Elton, who was a Brett Brown guy and a Sixers guy. I think there is still a bottom line of, we want this to happen quickly. We did the quote unquote process years for so long, and we want results. And now, they went all in, and I think that they, if it doesn't work out, like I said, it could end up being that, the future's not great.
Just in terms of Joel Embiid, Ben Simmons. I mean, look, I still feel they're very young. In 3 years from now, these are going to be totally different players in terms of their maturity. But at this stage of their career, do you consider them to have championship DNA? Do they have enough will, desire, want to be champions at the age that they are currently at?
It's tough to tell, Mike. I would say yes. The main thing I worry about with Joel is just the health and the durability. I think it's really difficult to build a championship culture around a player that's, you're not necessarily certain that he's going to be able to go to battle with you night in and night out. And I think that was reflected, obviously, in the signing of Horford. When you have to commit so many resources to kind of a backup option for your top option, you're, almost sort of setting yourself up for failure. So I think it is going to be difficult to continue to construct a championship culture around him. But in terms of Ben and Joel, from being around them, I do think that they're both, extremely motivated to get this done, regardless of what people say on Twitter about them or in the media. I know there's some, negative things that get said about them, but in terms of in the court and the work they put in, I do both think that they want to be great, and they have that championship DNA. Maybe it's still a bit of immaturity when we're talking about guys that are in their third and fourth year in the league. Maybe it'll improve in the next couple of years, but I do think it's there. They just need better pieces around them, frankly, I think.
So right now, I mean, chime in if I'm wrong with this, but right now it feels like this is the new low for the Sixers this year today, at least from a fan's perspective and everything on Twitter. I mean, you see it as much as anyone, MKB, but how much worse do you think it would have to get for, a breaking news, Brett Brown has been fired, like Woj bomb before the season ends?
Right, that's a good question. I know half of Philly is probably waiting to see it today, but I really think it would take a complete torpedo job. I mean, a 10-game losing streak, dropping down to borderline out of the playoffs. I just think that and that's not to say that he's not going to get ultimately be removed after the season. I just think at this point they're invested in him, in the group they have, and it's at this point even if there were great candidates out there that they could quickly implement, which I don't think there is necessarily. It's just so late in the year for a coach that's not unless it was going to be another guy from the bench that's already there. It's so late to bring another guy in to try to implement something for a playoff run. I think that the organization, in terms of like the front office and ownership at this point, if you want to use the word resigned, in terms of, I think they're resigned to the fact that Brett's going to be the guy for the rest of this year. And a lot like it was last year. I was on here talking, was he going to get fired if they didn't get past the Raptors? I think it's going to be a similar situation come this summer where, if they're not getting past the first round, if they don't get out of the second round again, then his time is probably going to come. But it would take something, I think, really extreme for it to happen during the season.
I would agree, but it feels like we're getting closer to that extreme at the very least. I mean, the Sixers now fall to 9-18 on the road. Gil and I battle a lot with what that exactly means. 6-8, though, now against the top teams in the East, MKB. So Miami, Indy, Boston, Milwaukee, Toronto. We were clinging on to, well, at least they're beating the good teams. Well, today they hold a 6-8 record against those teams. And then, like I said, 9-18 on the road. How can they rectify this? And how much stock do you put into those two records?
I think you got to put a lot of stock into it, Ryan, because like you said earlier on, there was a thing you could always fall back on and say, yeah, they're kind of struggling against some of these sub-500 teams on the road. Maybe they're looking past them, maybe they're whatever, but at least, they're beating these top teams in the East that they'd have to play against. But, basically since the calendar switched from January, they lost that game in Indiana. Now that, the games to Miami, I think you really have to be concerned, if they would end up facing the Pacers in the playoffs or the Heat, in a first-round series. I don't think a lot of people would feel necessarily – I mean, might think they could win the series. You wouldn't write them off, but you wouldn't go into that series feeling like, okay, we have a great chance to win the series. And I think that's a legit concern. And obviously so is the road record. They're sixth right now in the conference. It's going to be an uphill battle to get home court advantage even in the first round. Long story short, meaning they're going to have to win games on the road in the postseason if they want to make any sort of noise. And it's just, it's alarming because I've never seen a team with such, high aspirations and play, so good at home. They have tied for the best home record in the NBA. I've never seen a team be that dominant at home and then so poor on the road, maybe around 500 to give or take a game or two like they've been the past couple of years. But, to be that poor on the road really, I think, shows something with the mental state of the team that, I think is concerning. And obviously, maybe next time we're talking next week, the team looks different. The rotation's been
It probably will.
They add some shooters, and then maybe we'll feel better about it. But, for right now in the short term, I'm definitely concerned with, their potential with, as currently constructed for sure.
MKB, Michael Kaskey-Blomain, CBS Sports, covers the Sixers. The trade deadline Thursday. Anything that you think that you're hearing or that's out there that makes the most sense?
Alec Burks is a name, Warriors guard that I've heard a couple times from a couple different people. I know it's been floated out there that obviously the Warriors are shopping him. The Sixers are interested. I've heard that there's been a lot of communication on that front, that the Warriors are looking for a second-round pick. It's obviously something that the Sixers have to give. So I think that he's a guy that's really likely. And then, otherwise, I think they're going to look for shooters. I think Robert Covington's probably out of the picture considering the asking price, but guys that are, fringe guys that they could add with for those picks. I think that's probably the main thing. I don't expect, like I said earlier, I don't expect a major thing in terms of any of the members of the starting five to be moved for sure.
All right, MKB at the Real Mike KB on Twitter. Follow him there. We'll certainly be tapping into him throughout the rest of this Sixers season, as of course you can hear all the Sixers action right here on 97.3 ESPN. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, fellas. Good talking to you.
Yeah, man. And he, like all guests, appear to be the Boardwalk Honda hotline.